Hello everyone, welcome to the massive open online course on Sociology of Development. It is going to commence from July 2021 and will run through October 2021. This is going to be a 30-hour course spanning over a period of 12 weeks, 3 months. This course is divided into 30 lectures, precisely 30 hours. The course outline that we are going to discuss right now, it is a 12-week course. We are going to discuss sociology of development through these 12 weeks. It will provide you with some sort of theoretical, empirical and methodological aspects of examining within quote development. In the first week, in the form of 2 lectures, we are going to discuss historical location of the idea of development within quote. When I say historical location of the idea of development, I am trying to draw your attention to the Second World War and the imperative to have or to have a desire for development that we are going to discuss how the concept of development in its economic, in its social, in its political, in its cultural manifestations, how it is a byproduct of the Second World War. We will discuss. In the second week, we are going to have 3 lectures. After having discussed historical location of the idea of development, as a corollary, we are going to discuss end of colonialism, the process of decolonization. India is no exception to this, end of colonialism, rise of nationalism in the third world and the desire for development, because India was also a colonized nation for almost 2 centuries. And how in the aftermath of the Second World War, how colonialism ended, India got political independence. Many other countries also became politically independent, including China, Japan and so on. And in the 50s, 60s, you will find there are different countries which we have, which attained independence. And there we witnessed the rise of nationalism in the third world, in rise of nationalism, nationalistic sentiments, which was based on anti-imperialistic thought, anti-colonialist thought, and the desire to make development possible. When I say sociology of development, we are going to discuss development especially in the third world. Development studies in general and sociology of development in particular attempts to analyze the patterns of development, the nature of development, the methodological implications of different patterns of development in third world societies, in developing or underdeveloped societies, underdeveloped economies. Okay? In the third week, we are going to have two lectures. One, classical sociology and the notions of social change. And then we will discuss ideas of evolution and progress. There, in this context, in the context of classical sociology and the notions of social change, we are going to discuss Wilbert Moore, we are going to discuss D.C. Tapes, we are going to have Durkheim, we are going to have Marx, we are going to have Weber and so on. Okay? This is very important. And then in the fourth week, okay, in the subsequent weeks, in the fourth week, in the fifth week and in the sixth week, in terms of 8 lectures, okay, we are going to encapsulate the first sociological account, the first and foremost sociological account of development within quote. Okay. What is that, the first and foremost account of sociological account of development? No, that is the modernization theory. What is that modernization theory? No, the modernization theory postulates that the less developed economies will make progress, will eventually catch up with development, provided they follow the social and economic systems of Western capitalism. This is important. Okay? I mean, then the way modernization theory has been framed, okay, it is basically a byproduct of American tradition. It is a byproduct of Chicago School, okay, in the 1940s and 1950s and also 1960s. That you will find that how it tried to legitimize the inequality, the orthodoxy, obscurantism of Western capitalist models of development, especially the models of development propounded by the colonizers, not the colonized, but the colonizers, especially the North American continent and European continent. Okay? To be very specific, please do not think that Europe also is a homogeneous category. Europe also is pretty heterogeneous. The kind of public policy that you may find in the United Kingdom, you may not find in the Scandinavian countries, right? But the way Europe, North America, they always make attempts to colonize the rest of the population, and their models of development were thought absolutely appropriate, which was challenged by later on, which was challenged by subsequent models of development in Latin America, Africa and Asia. We are going to discuss these things. Okay. Then in the 7th week, we are going to bring about critiques of modernization theory in terms of 2 lectures. In the 8th week, then what are those critiques? We will start with dependency theory, which emerged in the context of Latin America. Latin American reflections on underdevelopment, development of underdevelopment. Okay, in terms of 5 lectures, we are going to discuss dependency theory in the 8th and 9th week. In the 10th week, in terms of 2 lectures, we are going to dwell upon critiques of dependency theory. In the 11th week, we are going to discuss limits to growth thesis and post development. I mean, when you say growth, when you say development, when you say industrialization, when you say assembly line production, when you say large scale production, there is always a limit to such argument. And what are the debates in the post development era? Okay? And in the last week, in the 12th week, in terms of 3 lectures, we are going to discuss globalization and development in the 21st century. I mean, how paradigms of development which were thought of, which were framed by the proponents of modernization theory, how they are getting challenged today in the 21st century. Okay? Now, let us start with an overview of sociology of development. If you look at this, sociology of development refers to the application of social theory and analysis to societies, usually in the third world, which are undergoing a late transition of capitalist industrialization. India is no exception to this. That is why sociology of development is extremely important in the context of India. When I say India is no exception to this, I mean, what are those countries which have undergone a late transition of capitalist industrialization? Obviously not North America, obviously not United Kingdom, and so on. Countries from Latin America, Asia, Africa, they are undergoing a late transition of capitalist industrialization, basically agricultural economies, where you will find the dominant mode of production is agriculture. Okay? That is why I reiterate the point that sociology of development refers to the application of social theory and analysis to societies, usually in the third world, which are undergoing a late transition of capitalist industrialization. Okay? Okay. Then what we learn in social theory, political theory, economic theory, cultural theory, even scientific theory, they must be applied somewhere. Okay? This application is extremely important. Okay? What is a theory, for example? A theory refers to a set of interrelated propositions intended to explain facts or events. That the provision of having some kind of the provision of explanation from a particular theory is extremely important. Okay? A theory becomes or the theory is at its best only when it is applied, right? Okay? That is why I said sociology of development refers to the application of social theory, I mean a set of interrelated propositions intended to explain facts or events, and analysis to societies. Such application of social theory and analysis to societies usually in the third world, usually in the underdeveloped economies which are undergoing a late transition of capitalist industrialization. Okay? Perhaps these third world economies, these underdeveloped economies, these developing societies, okay, they are still in the feudal hangover. They are not able to come out of feudal mode of production. Okay? That is very important. Okay? Then when you see this, that countries like India, developing countries such as India, are undergoing a late transition of capitalist industrialization precisely because it is still dominated by agricultural mode of production, dominated by zamindari system, feudal system of production, and then you tend to find out that we have not yet embraced, we have not yet come out of feudalism to establish a society which is based on industrial revolution, based on manufacturing industries, based on critical thinking, rationality, reasoning capacity. I mean, the whole sort of Western or European enlightenment system. Okay? It does not imply that European enlightenment is absolutely rational. It is also not absolute, nothing is absolute in this world. Okay? Now when I say that these third world economies, I mean these underdeveloped economies, developing economies, they are undergoing a late transition of capitalist industrialization, including India. Okay? I mean, if you look at the mode of production debate in Indian economy, then you will find that it is semi-feudal and semi-capitalist in nature. You can look at the work of, for example, Alice Turner in the 1960s and 1970s, the way she wrote about the mode of production debate in Indian agriculture. It is semi-feudal and semi-capitalist. Okay? In this context, the vantage point from which we started, that historical location of the idea of development within quote, development within quote, okay, that the vantage point is still the Second World War for us. Okay? If that is the vantage point primarily for the debates surrounding development studies in general and sociology of development in particular, then you will find that there is another vantage point that we have to discuss later on towards the end of the course, of course. That vantage point will be how there is a withdrawal of the state from the basic necessities of life, and how the minimalist role of the state in protecting human needs has given way to the rise of corporates to control human behavior, human action, and so on. Okay? We will discuss how, but that if we are discussing the vantage point of, I mean, from which we are going to discuss, we have been discussing sociology of development, I mean the Second World War, then Second World War, I mean mid 1940s, then we are going to discuss the second vantage point from which we are going to debate sociology of development, patterns of development, nature of development, and so on. That will be from the last decade of the 20th century, and then it runs through the 21st century. Okay? How we have lost out, how we have destroyed certain paradigms, and how those paradigms have been replaced and so on. We will see later on. But for the time being, the vantage point still remains the Second World War. Okay? That is why I said sociology of development in particular and development studies in general, okay, it refers to the application of social theory and analysis to third world societies which are undergoing a late transition of capitalist industrialization. I mean Europe, North America, they all they changed their mode of production from agriculture to industry in the 17th century, 18th century and so on. But even today, countries like India, we are not able to move out of feudal mode of production to capitalist mode of production. Okay? Okay. That is why we are undergoing a late transition of capitalist industrialization. Okay. Sociology of development has been particularly concerned with analyzing the social effects of development on class relations, one, and secondly, social groups such as the peasantry and the urban poor. When I say sociology of development has been specifically concerned with analyzing the social effects of development on class relations, what is class? What are classes? If I say, what are classes? Classes, for example, according to Weber, classes are based on life chances and causal components. For Marx, classes are manifestations of economic differentiation. Classes are constituted not on the basis of income that one earns, but on the basis of the position that one occupies in the process of production. For example, if there are two blacksmiths, one an owner of the farm and the other a paid worker, then both belong to two different classes, not one. And Marx was not the first to discover social classes or their plights. Many philosophers did it before him. But Marx came to the center stage when he said that the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. It does not imply that interpretation is not important. Yes, interpretation is very important. Even Weber, for example, was in favor of, or Weber propagated interpretive sociology. Interpretation, Marx also never denies that no, interpretation is not a, but the hitherto existing modes of knowledge production have always tried to interpret rather than changing them. That is where Marx differed from other philosophers, economists, sociologists and so on, okay, in the 19th century. When I said class relations, then the class relations between the owner and the worker, between the capitalist and the worker, between the bourgeois and the proletariat, that class relations. Okay? And the development that we tend to witness today, the kind of development that we tend to witness today, it sides with or it has sided with a particular class or a particular set of classes, not all classes. Whether we frame public policy, whenever we frame, whenever we formulate our budget, okay, it always tries to address a particular class or a particular set of classes. That is why it is extremely important to understand how sociology of development has been particularly concerned with analyzing the social effects of development on class relations. Okay? Whether the social effects of development or the impact of development has benefited the poor, the marginalized, the peasantry, the destitutes, or the public policy or the development paradigms that we have modeled we have framed for a long period of time, or have they strengthened the grips of, or have they strengthened the interests of only a few dominant classes, a few dominant caste groups, a few dominant racial groups, and so on. That is why class relations are extremely important. Okay? Even you look at class relations or caste groups or patriarchy, you can look at white supremacy, racism and so on. Okay? That is why we are particularly concerned with analyzing the social effects of development on class relations, one. Secondly, we are also concerned with analyzing the social effects of development on certain social groups such as the peasantry and the urban poor, and mostly these urban poor of the peasant background, you will find. Okay? Now, when you look at this, that we are concerned with analyzing the social effects of development on the peasantry on the one hand and the urban poor on the other, or other marginalized sections of the society. This is going to be extremely important precisely because Western capitalist models of development have always been concerned with the corporate sector, with the dominant class groups, the dominant whites. Okay? They have for a pretty long period of time, they have ignored the interests of the blacks, the women, the migrants, the various other marginalized sections of the society, and so on, even poor, right? That's why in the context of India, we cannot afford to lose sight of these social groups, namely the peasantry and the urban poor. Okay? Even if you say, no, this is an urban setup, this is a city, Mumbai is a metropolitan city, Delhi is a metropolitan city, Kolkata is a metropolitan city, and so on, you will find that these metropolitan cities have created the largest number of slums in the country. Then having known as metropolitan cities loses its meaning. We tend to lose the meaning of having a metropolitan city or a set of metropolitan cities if you have created largest number of slums in the country. That is why we are also concerned about the urban poor, and such urban poor mostly of the peasant background. Why we are talking about peasantry here? Precisely because most of the third world societies, third world economies, including India, okay, they are basically agriculture dominant country. India is predominantly an agricultural society. Even today in 2021, almost 45% of the population, almost 40% of the population in India, they depend on agriculture for their livelihood, for their survival. If I say 130-40 crores of India's population, okay, 40%, I mean almost 50-60 crores of the population of India, they depend on agriculture for their livelihood, for their survival. Okay? This is extremely important then. Okay? And now when we frame public policy, perhaps we do not consider these groups, peasantry or urban poor, into consideration. Okay? That is why it is extremely important for the proponents of sociology of development, or the scholars of sociology of, or the students of sociology of development, to be concerned with analyzing the social effects of development on class relations and on social groups such as the peasantry and the urban poor. Development studies emerged as a distinct area of research in the post Second World War period, and was associated with the growing concern for the political and economic development of the post colonial world. Okay? Earlier, prior to the emergence of development studies as a distinct area of research in the post Second World War period, perhaps it was not considered a distinct discipline, development studies and so on. Okay? Development studies was mostly equated with only economic development. Even today, when we look at this, development, we look at the very crude indicators, crude economic indicators of development. Okay? But actually, economic development is not a narrow field; it's very broad. Economics of development. Okay? It's very broad. Okay? But when we look at certain indicators of development, we always look at per capita income. But what we observe, that even if there is a rise in our per capita income, our standard of living does not rise. Then there is some problem in that indicator of development, right? Okay. Even if your GDP increases, okay, our standard of living, our housing pattern, our nutrition, our health, our insurance, our education, they do not rise. Then there is some problem in that indicator of development as such. Okay? Okay? Or in their computation. Okay? We will see. Then the first sociological account of development was modernization theory. I mean, when I said the first sociological account of development within quote was modernization theory, which held that the less developed countries would eventually catch up with the industrialized world, provided they emulated the economic and social systems of Western capitalism. In other words, the modernization theory postulates that the less developed countries would eventually catch up with the already developed ones if they emulate, if they ape the economic and social systems of the already developed countries. Then how UK has made development possible, or how US has made development possible, or how France has made development possible, or Germany has made development possible, then what the proponents of modernization theory suggest, that no, countries like India must follow the pattern of economic development, social development, the way US has made or UK has made. We have to copy them. Okay. I mean, then the third world societies were expected to follow the patterns of development of the colonizers. Okay? Okay? Now, why is it so? Now, precisely because the modernization theory is largely based on the theoretical premises of structural functionalism. What is structural functionalism? Structural functionalism suggests creation and maintenance of the hitherto existing social and economic structures and institutions in a capitalist society. Structural functionalism is based on the fact that, structural functionalism suggests that society has been composed of complementarity and reciprocity of roles in the social division of labor. And that is how modernization theory conceptualized development as a staged transition from tradition to modernity, to be brought about at three levels: at the economic level, at the social level, and at the political level. When I said modernization theory conceptualized development as a staged transition from tradition to modernity, to be brought about at the economic level, I mean by the operations of the market and foreign investment. When I said at the social level, by the adoption of appropriate Western institutions, values and behaviors, then whatever the West suggests, whatever the kind of market that they have, the kind of foreign investment that they have, the kind of Western institutions that they have, the kind of Western values that they have, the kind of Western behaviors, manners, culture, rules, regulations, norms, whatever the colonizers have, we must try to follow that. Okay? That is what the modernization theory suggests. And at the political level, by the implementation of parliamentary democracy, precisely because we were under colonial rule for a couple of centuries, and then whatever the British suggested and the British followed, we were trying to follow that. Okay. Now that is why I said, based largely on the theoretical premises of structural functionalism, modernization theory conceptualized development as a staged transition from tradition to modernity. For example, from traditional society to pre-takeoff, from pre-takeoff to takeoff, from takeoff to drive to maturity, from drive to maturity to high mass consumption. It is a staged transition, as Rostow, W. Rostow post this, that it is a staged transition from Rostow. Okay. He said traditional society, okay, then pre-takeoff, then takeoff, then drive to maturity, and then high mass consumption. Okay. It is a staged transition from tradition to modernity, which would be brought about at the economic level by the operations of the market and foreign investment, at the social level by the adoption of appropriate Western institutions, norms, values, behavior patterns, customs, cultural practices and so on, and at the political level by the implementation of parliamentary democracy. Okay. It is basically, then in the 1960s and 70s, what we witnessed at a global level, that a product of the Cold War and motivated by the concern to challenge socialist ideas in the post-colonial world, modernization theory was criticized for its optimism, oversimplification and ethnocentrism. What are these? We are going to discuss when we will be discussing modernization theory and its critics. Okay. It was that is why modernization theory was displaced in the late 1960s as the most popular sociological analysis of development by the dependency approach. Okay. This dependency theory is a byproduct of Latin American reflections on development of underdevelopment. Dependency theory is a byproduct of a combination of neo-Marxism on the one hand and the ECLA tradition, United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, on the other. Okay. We will discuss when we will be discussing dependency theory. I am trying to provide you with historical location of the idea of development in the very first lecture. The dependency theory was in turn charged with oversimplification and with merely inverting the assumptions of the previous orthodoxy. Previous orthodoxy, when I say, I refer to basically modernization theory. Okay. When I said, what is that dependency theory? That in layman's language, the third world, the colonized nations, the developing countries, they tend to provide raw material, cheap labor force to the colonizers, to the Western capitalist world, and in turn we tend to receive the finished products. That is how we become perennially dependent on the developed countries for technology, for novel technology, for novel medicine, for novel seed, for finished goods and so on. All of you must be aware of the fact that how India used to supply raw cotton material to Great Britain, and Great Britain in turn used to send finished goods in the form of cotton shirts, cotton garments and so on, okay, at a hugely inflated price. Okay. Precisely because we did not know how to prepare these garments in a machine, and we didn't know assembly line production in this context, okay, the way today China and US have done. Okay. Criticism of these approaches such as modernization theory and dependency theory has left the sociology of development as a fragmented field in which various competing and more modest theories jostle for supremacy. In recent years, there has been a growing awareness that the nation state cannot be analyzed in isolation from the international context. Today, whatever we talk about, whichever way we try to describe Indian situation today, what we generally find that our pattern of development, our nature of development trajectory cannot be divorced from the international context. Okay? That's how we talk about economic expansion, political expansion, military expansion and so on. Okay? The field of sociology of development also has significant and growing overlaps with the sociological debates about globalization and the environment. There has also been a renewed analytic emphasis on the interdependency and integration among nations, not just in terms of economic processes, but also at the level of culture and ideology. That's why we talk. That's why we talk about globalization. I mean, how was globalization conceptualized initially? That integration of different nations, integration of various nations into a single unified whole, okay, in terms of economic globalization. But now there is an imposition of ideology, there is an imposition of culture, what I am going to eat, we are going to have I mean in terms of food or robbing pattern, I mean dress, it is going to, I mean these things are also imposed upon us, right. We are now living in a more globalized world. For example, Serge Latouche argues that the concept of Serge Latouche argues that the concept of third world development is rooted in specifically Western ideas of technical progress and the accumulation of capital, and this leads to development policies which destroy the cultures of non-Western populations. You look at many states, many countries where there is a sense of fear that the cultural practices of different communities are subject to extinction. You look at the great Andamanis, you look at the tattooing practices among the Apatani tribe in Arunachal Pradesh, their cultural practices are subject to extinction today. Okay. And the way you will find that the Western, I mean especially the capitalist nations, they try to impose their cultural practices on us, okay, in terms of food, in terms of dress, in terms of our cultural practices, I think must be examined critically. Okay. In particular, Latouche maintains that the drive towards global uniformity in cultures, lifestyles and mentalities has been responsible for endemic civil wars, ecological disasters and the widespread national debt throughout the world. Okay. Then very quickly, if I have to recapitulate what we have discussed, we initially in this lecture we started with an overview of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development, which is going to commence from July 2021 till October 2021, and then we have discussed how Sociology of Development in particular and development studies in general refers to the application of social theory and analysis to societies usually in the third world, which are undergoing a late transition of capitalist industrialization. Sociology of development has been particularly concerned with analyzing the social effects of development on class relations and social groups such as the peasantry and the urban poor, how development studies emerged as a distinct area of research in the post-war period and was associated with the growing concern for the political and economic development of the post-colonial world, and that's how we came to the American hegemony in terms of the modernization theory. The first sociological account of development was modernization theory. It's a byproduct of Chicago School, um, which which became very popular in the 1950s and 1960s, and it was characterized by economic, political, colonial and military expansion throughout the world. The modernization theory postulates that the less developed countries would eventually catch up with development, or would eventually catch up with the industrialized world if they emulated the economic and social systems of Western capitalism. And then we have discussed how modernization theory is largely based on the theoretical premises of structural functionalism. Structural functionalism is nothing but complementarity and reciprocity of roles in the social division of labor. I mean, creation and maintenance of basic structures and institutions of a capitalist society, and how modernization theory conceptualized development as a staged transition from tradition to modernity, to be brought about at the economic level by the operations of the market and foreign investment, at the social level by the adoption of appropriate Western institutions, religious systems, values, norms, rules, regulations, behaviors, customs, cultural practices, and so on, and at the political level by the implementation of parliamentary democracy. And then we have I mean, that's how we have discussed how modernization theory tried to conceptualize development as a stage transition. For example, if you look at Rostow, then we have discussed how it's a stage transition from traditional society to pre-takeoff, to takeoff, to drive to maturity, to high mass consumption. Okay. Okay, it's a stage transition. It's in the I mean, it's evolutionary in nature. Okay, but later on we will see how it may not be a stage transition. Okay, a product of the Cold War, that the Cold War especially, I mean, between the capitalist world led by the United States of America on the one hand, and the socialist world led by the erstwhile USSR on the other, and motivated by the concern to challenge socialist ideas in the post-colonial world, modernization theory was criticized for its optimism, oversimplification and ethnocentrism. When I say especially ethnocentrism, we are going to discuss this when we will be dealing with the ideological critique of the dichotomous approaches of modernization theory. I mean, how ethnocentrism, how an ethnocentric worldview, this ethnocentrism especially, it was coined by William Graham Sumner in 1906 to describe certain prejudicial attitudes, prejudices between in-groups and out-groups. I mean, when I say in-group, I mean my group, our group, and out-group means your group or their groups, right? Okay. Sumner coined the term ethnocentrism to describe prejudicial attitudes between in-groups and out-groups, where you will find that our systems, our culture, our behavior pattern are essentially uncritically and unquestionably treated as superior to their social arrangements. Okay? Then I will say that if the kind of food that I eat is superior to the kind of food that you eat, okay, then there is a problem. Okay? That's why modernization theory was challenged for this kind of worldview, for having this kind of worldview, for propagating this kind of worldview. That's why you will find with the passage of time, when we will be discussing modernization theory and its critics, we will try to bring about a threefold critique of the modernization theory. I mean, the ideological critique, the empirical critique, and the methodological or meta-theoretical critique of the dichotomous approaches to modernization theory. Okay? And then we have discussed how the modernization theory was displaced in the late 1960s as the most popular sociological analysis of development by the dependency approach, which is a byproduct of the Latin American debates on development of underdevelopment, and the dependency theory was in turn charged with oversimplification and with merely inverting the assumptions of modernization theory. And criticism of these approaches, we have discussed how criticism of these approaches such as modernization theory on the one hand and dependency theory on the other. I mean, this is basically a Western capitalist model of development, whereas dependency theory is a byproduct of Latin American model of development of underdevelopment. Okay? When we will be discussing dependency theory, you will find how dependency theory at a more intellectual level, at a more theoretical level, how it is a combination, or how it is a byproduct of two intellectual elements. One is neo-Marxism and the other ECLA tradition, I mean United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America. Okay? That is why criticism of these, of both approaches, such as modernization theory as well as dependency theory, has left the sociology of development as a much fragmented field in which various competing and more modest theories jostle for supremacy. Okay? In recent years, what we generally find that there has been a growing awareness that the nation state cannot be analyzed in isolation from the international context. That is why I said, when you talk about economic expansion, political expansion, expansion of the market, EXIM policy, export-import policy, when you look at military expansion, colonial expansion, okay, you will find that these interests, such interests cannot be examined in isolation, cannot be divorced from the international political situation. The field of sociology of development also has significant and growing overlaps with the sociological debates about globalization and the environment. When we look at economic development alone, then please look at the construction of dams throughout the country. You look at Subansiri Dam in the context of Assam and Arunachal Pradesh border. You can look at Narmada Bachao Andolon. You can look at the construction of Hirakud Dam in Odisha, and what kind of environmental implications that the construction of dam has. Not simply environmental implications, but also the questions of livelihood, the questions of displacement of the indigenous population. You can look at Rajaji National Park, where one Gujar's community have been displaced over the years because of the construction of a national park. Okay? Now there is a debate between development on the one hand and environment on the other, and perhaps the way we look at globalization today, globalization is not limited to economic processes, it is not limited to economic phenomena. rather rather what we generally find that there has also been a renewed analytic emphasis on the interdependency and integration among nations, not just in terms of economic processes, not just in terms of economic phenomena, but also at the level of culture and ideology. That is going to be extremely that is going to have absolutely dithering effects on the process of nation building and so on. And then what we have discussed, I mean Serge Latouche, how Latouche argues that the concept of third world development is rooted in specifically Western ideas of technical progress and the accumulation of capital. Perhaps I mean what the way public policy has been framed in Indian context, the way development has been projected in Indian context, perhaps it is reduced to only technical progress and accumulation of capital by a particular class, by a particular dominant class, by a particular or maybe by a particular set of classes. That leads to development policies which destroy the cultures of non-Western populations, that which destroy or which have dithering effects, which have adverse effects on the marginalized, the peasantry, the urban poor, on women and so on. Okay. In particular, the drive towards global uniformity in cultures, lifestyles and mentalities has been responsible for endemic civil wars and ecological disasters that we are going to discuss throughout the course, and the widespread national debt throughout the world. That's how, I mean, when in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the IMF and the World Bank were established, okay, then they started giving loans at a very high rate of interest to the developing world, and the developing world, including India, perhaps failed to build infrastructure, and now we are in a debt trap. Okay. It is I mean widespread national debt throughout the third world, not simply India, but many underdeveloped countries, developing countries, they are in the debt. Okay. This is what we have discussed in the first lecture. In the second lecture, we are going to discuss how development is fundamentally a process of change. I mean at the level of, I mean at the economic level, socio-cultural level, political level, physical structure, value system, way of life, and how subjective evaluative characteristics and objective empirical characteristics are extremely important to examine development. That we are going to discuss in the next lecture. Thank you.